and welcome to our webinar, Don't Let Politics Block Your Digital Initiatives. I'm Allie McDonald, Senior Associate Digital Editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's event will be recorded. We'll be sending a link to the on-demand recording as well as our speaker's slide deck within the next few days. During the event, we welcome your questions for our speaker today. To submit questions, please enter them anytime in the questions module on the GoToWebinar control panel. Or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag MITSMREvent. We'll answer as many questions as time permits in the hour. If you're having audio difficulties at any time while listening via computer, there are call-in instructions in the chat section of the control panel. So our speaker today is Jane McConnell, an advisor, researcher, and management briefer on digital strategies inside organizations, and a contributing author for MIT Sloan Management Review. Jane, welcome. We're pleased to have you here today, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Allie. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share a few things about myself before I get deep into internal politics. The first is that I've worked as a strategy advisor with large organizations for nearly 20 years now. I have been conducting research with, excuse me one second, having a little slowness here on the slide. 10 years of research about internal digital work environments. Allie, I'm sorry to stop here, but there seems to be something that's not letting me control the slides here. I'll continue talking anyway. I run a digital practice group in Paris called Intra Network, and I write articles that have been published by you guys and also a bit by the Harvard Business Review. Now I need to be able to get to my next slide. There we go. Sorry about that, everyone. What I want to talk to you about today is the question of internal politics and how they can really hinder digital initiatives, but there are things that you can do about it. We're going to talk about how you can go deep into your organization, getting people involved at all levels. So many projects start at the top. By the time they reach people on the edges of the organization, it becomes an us and them, very conducive for internal politics. Decision making is extremely important because if you don't have the right people involved, it'll be much, much harder to get buy-in. It's very hard for people to play politics if they and their group were part of the decision makers themselves. Silos are a big question in organizations. They are a reality. There are certain positive things about silos, but primarily we're going to look today at things you can do to fluidify, increase the information flows across silos, thereby decreasing internal politics. The why. Why do we have internal politics? It's human nature. Whenever you have a group of people who work together, there's always going to be this delicate balance between freedom and rules. The balance changes based on where you are in the organization, what the topic is, but there's always this tension, ongoing tension, be how much freedom do people have, and what are the rules that we've agreed to as an organization. Digital initiatives really hit at the heart of organizations. They impact how people work, what they can do, what they can't do. And so it's a very, very, how would I say, high pressure trigger that can really kick off some serious internal political struggles. Now, what I want to do is take a few minutes and go back in time, about 20, 25 years back, and do a very quick review of how our internal digital work environments have evolved, because that explains a lot. At the beginning, what I call era one, nearly all organizations had a very simple top-down place online, often called an intranet, for official documents, official information, some links to applications. Many of them were built on Lotus Notes, and they were almost always owned by corporate communication. Era two, we started touching on things a little bit more, not confrontational, but potentially conflictive, when business and IT teams built separate spaces for project management. These places were sometimes not even visible to the rest of the company. And it became an issue about, do you want people to go into your work environment via a project group, structured collaboration, or via the managed dimension? And so that became quite a problem. HR also often had their own space. So you can imagine how it became confusing for employees. Era 3 was an exciting time. It was exciting because blogging and networking became part of the way people were communicating and working in organizations. I call that the period where it was the end of the domination of official content managers. It was a beginning of freedom for people. However, we still have a case where we tended to have 3 separate spaces again. It wasn't integrated by any means. Era 4 was a moment when, and that's pretty much where we are today, between 3 and 4. Era 4 began when technology solutions began to make it possible to have a blend of these, what I previously called 3 dimensions. So from a people viewpoint, you had a social place, you could access your project, you could look up managed information, references, policies, whatever. And what's interesting about Era 4 is that's where individuals began to gain more control over their own digital workplace experience. At the same time, we have 2 major trends that began to, I would say, heat things up even more. One is mobile access. A lot of organizations had not yet dealt with it. It's fairly recent in the last few years that organizations have true mobile strategies. And because people needed to get information, they wanted to use their mobile devices, they started using their own, what you call the BYOD, bring your own device, which of course raised serious security questions. Consumer-like cloud services were becoming popular also. People were sharing documents in real time online for projects and communication with colleagues. And they simply said, we need to share these documents, and our own IT environment does not give us a way of doing it. So we're in a situation now where people are beginning to get, I would say, more power, more autonomy in how they work and with what tools. And what is a concern for a lot of people is that the traditional, what I call stakeholders, were beginning to lose control to some extent. The reality is their roles were changing, but it was perceived as losing control. For example, communication managers were no longer the absolute authorities for the message, the target, and the timing of the message, because people were communicating on their own. IT was no longer in complete control of the tool set being used by people, the rollout of tools. People were getting their own stuff online, sharing it with others. And at a risk of security to the organization, people were basically saying, we've got to do our jobs, we need this. HR is another question, because HR has always been a reference point for expertise in the organization. They normally fill the employee directory. They have profiles of people. This is all changing now with the social collaborative dimension, because people are, filling in their own profiles on a social network. Personal branding is becoming a big thing right now. Someone who's out there on the enterprise social network answering questions, helping other people, becomes perceived very quickly as the go-to person for whatever the topic is. And that go-to person is not necessarily the official expert. And so that made a lot of HR people feel uncomfortable. Leadership at the top levels of the organization. Leadership, I wouldn't go so far as to say losing control, but they certainly, the decision-making capacity of leadership was definitely being diluted to some extent. The hierarchical controls were less than they had been in the past because of what people were able to do themselves online. And I'd like to tell you a quick little story about that I know firsthand about a bank in a Scandinavian country. Management had made a decision that was not popular with employees. People grumbled, but nothing changed. Then one day, one of the top managers published a post in their enterprise social network in an attempt to explain the decision. One person responded to the post, and she expressed all sorts of reasons why people were against the decision that management had made. Just one response out of several thousand employees. But the amazing thing was that within 48 hours, there were hundreds and hundreds of likes on her response. That I like to call this story the power of like. To their credit, the management rethought their decision. They made some changes, and so they adapted, I would say, well, reactively, not proactively, but they did adapt. However, what was interesting in this case is they hadn't realized in advance that their decision-making power would be called into question. And it's thanks to the visibility in the, how would I say, the social world that that's able to happen. So we're in a situation now where people have a lot more autonomy. I like to say they're more liberated from before. There are lots of initiatives going on in the organization. There's like an explosion of creativity in some companies, a lot of energy, a lot of excitement about what they can do. And this is the same time that organizations, especially leaders in organizations, realize we need a global approach to our digital initiative. So they begin to define a global transformation program, which would include digital, among other things. What's interesting about this is it's global now. It, in theory, involves everybody in the organization. It raises a lot of issues. Like, is this something that's being imposed on us from the top? Have we lost our freedom of decision making? Is this like common vanilla for everybody, or can we still have the special, unique things that we feel we need to do our jobs? We are happy with what we have now. We don't need anything else. And the people behind the global initiative is also saying, but we're going to build something that's even better together. You can imagine how these kinds of reactions and legitimate feelings and concerns trigger internal political struggles. And before we go further into the material I want to share with you today, we'd like to do a quick poll with you.
Great, thank you, Jane. So Jane has a poll for all participants to respond to. The poll is, do internal politics impact your digital initiatives? So there are 4 responses, so please answer. And Jane will then compare the responses from this webinar to a larger survey of responses she's seen in other organizations.
Okay, we have quite a few votes there, Allie.
We do. So it looks like we have a bit of a split. So 4% have no problems at all. So lucky them. 40%, it's a manageable concern requiring special effort. 48% feel it's a serious concern that's holding us back. And 8% don't know and aren't sure at this time. So I'll let you take it away again, Jane.
That's really interesting. The 48% of those who feel that it's a serious concern is a high figure. Maybe that's one reason you are attending this webinar, and I hope I'll be able to help you in that domain. The top bar that you see represents a survey of approximately 300 organizations that took place in the middle of 2016. And the bottom bar was a survey of roughly the same number of organizations that took place 4 years earlier in 2013. 2 things that are striking here. One is, if you look here at the ones who have already dealt with it, in other words, no problems, your response was 4%. Here we have 6%, which has gone to 18%. So there's been some progress made. Look over here at the serious concern holding us back. 13% has now increased to 22%. And what I would like to add here is that these figures they come from the organizations in my survey who were among the most digitally advanced. And so to think that 22% of organizations that are advancing well in their digital initiatives still have 22% that are being hindered seriously by internal politics is quite a number. What I want to move into now is how we can do things about this. Let's start first with how you can involve more people in the organization, because this is a clear problem that we have. The data here comes from 2016, and when I put this chart together, I was genuinely surprised when I saw the results. I saw that nearly 80% of these 300 organizations say digital has a clear role, clearly expressed in our strategic vision. So I think that's fantastic. That's a lot. Then look at a few other questions where, for example, the first one here, top leadership is strongly involved, not just defining it as part of our vision, but we are involved in it. We've dropped down here to 60% who are and who feel it's effective. Then here comes the real crunch. Collaborative and cross-organizational decision-making is low. This is where well-intended, high-level, top-level initiatives often fall down because they've been defined from the top, and I would say middle-level people throughout the organization, operational people, have not been involved, and they are therefore not really bought into it yet. You see those figures are about the same. The bottom figure shows us that when you get down to the front line and operational people, they don't have a sense of ownership yet about these changes coming from the digital initiatives that are taking place in the organization. And it's a real sort of what I call a trickle-down approach, which is not very effective. And the alignment, that's to say a cross-organizational framework where people feel this is a framework, it's part of my, it guides my organization, I have a place in it, I have a part, it's coherent for me. The figure there is very low. This is what you see on the left there. It's been a what I call a superficial approach, a real top-down approach in terms of the data that we see there. And what's important, what would be so much better, would be to have a deeper approach where there's a lot of communication between, I've simplified this greatly by having talked about enterprise senior management, sort of a middle level, country, divisional, functional management, operational front lines. There needs to be conversations taking place when you define your strategy and talk about your rollout plan between the front lines and their direct management, between those managers and the top. And there needs to be communication between a flow of information between the top. And you notice my arrows are bi-directional. It's not top down, it's also bottom up. And these flows are very important because when you define a digital initiative, you notice I use the word negotiating. There's a lot of negotiating that goes on when you do this. There's not one viewpoint that's going to be right. And without these conversational flows taking place in different directions, it's almost impossible to come to a good agreement. What I want to do now here is talk to you about fairly quickly, three examples of organizations I have either worked with or met and discussed with where they have deepened the involvement in their organization. And the first is an industrial company. It's the one I call Frontlines. I worked with them in a workshop mode for several months. And in the first workshop, we were defining the scope and the goals and so on of the initiative. And the central function people, comms, IT, and HR, honestly felt that they did not need to have customer-facing people in the workshop because they knew what those people's needs were. It was a sincere reaction on their part, genuine. That's really the way they felt. The project owner forced the point, and we had 2 or 3 customer-facing people who joined the workshop, and it made a huge change. Excuse me one second. Made a huge change in the results that we got. I remember this argument quite strong between a senior HR person who said, we don't need to list all the HR contacts and all the business units and offices on this particular section of our digital project. Everyone knows they can call us and they can get the name they need. Customer-facing person said, do you know that people out there don't even know you and your name? So how could we call you? And there was this like silence in the room. And he continued saying, something along the lines of, you people in HQ, you just don't realize how far we are from all of you, and the information you all take for granted is far from us. And it was a real eye-opening moment that changed the tone of the rest of the workshop. The second point I have on the slide is a young new workforce. This was a workshop I did with an engineering and architect group, fairly large. led a workshop with very senior people, and the top guy in the workshop said he wanted to bring some young people in. And he brought in 4 young people who'd been in his company for less than 2 years, but long enough to have built up a reputation professionally. They were well regarded by colleagues and team leaders. This top guy said, I wanted to hear young voices, but I want these voices to be respected by the senior people, not just dismissed as these are crazy young people on social networks. These young people brought so much energy to the workshop. The older people listened to them very carefully, and vice versa. The young people with these ideas they had about the future workplace for the organization listened with a great deal of respect to what the older people, what the senior employees, how they reacted and what they thought. And they ended up with a great plan for renovating the digital workplace they had at the time because of that blend between those 2 experiences. The third one is a little bit more different from those first 2. It's a company in the life science sector who redefined their brand and their values. And they had a parallel exercise with that definition where they were defining collaboratively in workshops they organized across the company, new behaviors that corresponded to their new values, which had sort of a digital new way of working orientation. The process took over a year, but they finished up with a lot of buy-in and traction with people working together, defining key behaviors that represent our new values. And what was interesting about what they did was they had the values. For each value, they defined 2, maybe it was 3, but I definitely remember 2 levels of what it meant in terms of behavior. They had what they called the foundation, which meant for everyone. And then they have the executive behavior, and they defined it for each one of the values. And I'll give you just one quick example. One of their values was to be entrepreneurial. At the foundation level, therefore for everyone, they said the behavior is to understand the impact of your own work on the immediate business environment. At the executive level, the behavior was you create a mindset of taking challenges head on by giving sizable responsibility to people in your team who demonstrate entrepreneurial spirit. And what I think is really interesting there is that I don't have any facts about this, but I really think that those executive level statements are going to bring up a number of people in the organization who look at the foundation behavior being looked for, the executive behavior being looked for, and I think it creates a very interesting pressure on executives and incentive to other people in the organization to work at a higher level. And so the thing that was interesting in this activity was in their digital and cultural initiative, they worked at all levels. It was by no means top down, and it was not bottom up. It was a sort of how, if you can imagine, a parallel thing that sort of went across the entire organization. Okay, let's move on to decision making. How to broaden decision making, because one of the how would I say, one of the most common reactions to I don't want to be involved in this is because I wasn't part of making the decision. And something that is really, really, really critical, this next point. You need to identify what I call fundamental principles for your initiative. And by principle, I mean things that last in time. If you look over here, you'll agree with me, strategies change. They need to change. Circumstances change. But principles need to be really fundamental things that make up a sort of framework that everyone agrees with. And these fundamental principles need to be defined collaboratively. This is not a top-down thing that should be happening. It's not from the project team only. It needs to, you need a mechanism, and there are various ways you can do it, that will involve people from around the organization. I've got 3 examples here that come from cases I know. One organization said, all our digital initiatives will be clearly linked to operational and strategic needs. Another organization, this is a really important one, said, we will facilitate local initiatives rather than forcing central solutions. And that's quite empowering and quite I think that's something that probably most organizations should be doing today. It depends on the industry you're in, but I think it's a one that you need to think about seriously. Third one is important. We're going to talk about it in more detail in a minute. But the idea here is that as much as possible, the spaces, communities, and team sites in the digital environment, the different initiatives you have going on, need to be open, not closed, unless there are very important reasons for keeping them closed. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So many projects start off, people think we're going to keep this closed, it's just for us, etc. But this particular organization decided they were going to do open by default and closed only exceptionally. Second point about decision making is involving the right people from the beginning, in particular, the people from the edges of the organization. They are the closest to customers. They are out there hearing things that you in the center or in a central function don't necessarily hear or see. And if you picture yourself or myself as an external consultant, or someone as an internal project leader, you have some sponsor, some initiator, etc. And with that person or that group, you have an agreement on the scope of what you want to do. And it's very important. I like to think of it in terms of a zigzag approach, that you consult, get input from the front lines, from senior management, from BUs, from country management, and back and forth, checking, relating. You learn something, you verify it with someone else, working back and forth like that. Is quite a powerful, I would say, dynamic way of getting information. Because if you start at the top and go down, or if you start at the bottom and go up, your information, the data that you're collecting will be, how would I say, too structured based on the hierarchical place that you're at. Whereas if you're able to get information, for example, over here from the front lines, and then you want to compare, consult senior management about that information, and then maybe you go back to the country management, you're going to get a more complex, but a more truthful version of what it is that you're studying. We talk a lot about decision making, how it should not be top down. It should be, in my opinion, and what I've seen with organizations, it should be at the lowest level of accountability, not the lowest level of people involved in it, but who is truly accountable for this issue, and that should be the person who makes the final decision. However, it's not a one-person decision. That person needs to consult others who will be impacted by the decision, and of course, the decision made needs to respect the fundamental principles that have been defined. I'd like to share a few stories to illustrate this. The first I call simple framework, and that's because this very large industrial company, who is highly decentralized and has a range of different activities around the world, they decided to make their fundamental principles very simple, which I think was a very realistic and smart decision on their part. The first one was that everybody should be on the same technology. They accomplished that. Second one is that communities would exist across the silos of the organization, not within the silos. They wanted people to work together in ways that helped, how should I say, encourage cross-organizational collaboration and communication. And the third principle is quite a strong one. That is that business units and people are free to reinvent what they do based on the new platform, and that they have the freedom to, in their words, steer their own ships based on means, priorities, and context. So this organization, highly decentralized from the beginning, has found a way of respecting the decentralization of decision making while encouraging to a maximum flows across the organization through the framework of we're on the same technology, it's easy for us to share things. The edges, a retail company that I know quite well with thousands of young employees, practice decentralized decision making to an extreme. And the first day on the job, you're told you make the decisions and you do what you need to do to get your job done. You are accountable. You are free to do what you want to do, and you're accountable for the results. So Some people are intimidated by that. They don't stay very long in the company. Others find that liberating. And what's interesting, this business is growing extremely well, big business success.
Okay, so the excuse me. Now we're at the third and final part of the presentation about silos, how to what I call fluidify silos. We can't break them. They are part of the organization. We can build up greater flows between them, weaken them, so on and so on. And to some extent, silos are useful. They are where people live and work. It's like a neighborhood where they feel comfortable, but they need to be more open than they are in most organizations. I'm going to take you to four points. One is opening information sources. Another is making work visible. The third is to complement but not duplicate your organizational structure. I'll explain that in a minute. And to open silos, especially at the top of the organization. So, starting with opening information sources, I find it really interesting that 18% of companies I surveyed who say they have open information systems say internal politics are a serious concern. For those who they say our information systems are pretty much closed, half of them say they have serious concerns from internal politics. And so I find that an interesting figure there. What happens in many organizations, I've been through this with a number of companies, people say we can't open it, it's confidential, or we can't open it, no one else is going to be interested anyway, it's just for us. And it's important to clarify the fact that confidential means that if the information is misinterpreted, used incorrectly, handed to a third party, and the potential results would be legal, financial, competitive, or image risk, then of course you have to keep it closed. On the other hand, if it's specific to a group or part of the organization, that sort of no one else is interested, just for us, but having other people see it, create no risks, no consequences, then leave it open. And you'd be surprised, serendipity might bring some unexpected benefits sometimes. Second point I want to talk to you about is making work visible. And I've got an example here that I've identified because it's in the public domain. And I've got a reference at the bottom of the slide that when you get the slide deck, you can check it out in more detail, about Van Braun when he was working on the Apollo mission for NASA. He implemented a system where every Monday, every person who worked for him, the senior managers, lab directors, etc., had to send him a one-page note about the week's progress, the previous week, and problems. They sent to him individually. He commented in the margins about each note, returned it to each person individually. And what amazes me is you can find scanned copies of these notes on the internet. If you look, it's just amazing. But, okay, so that's already good. You've got bottom up and you've got top down. But the strong point I want to emphasize with you that he then had his assistant make a copy of the full package of notes. And everyone in the system got a copy of all the notes. And that's one of the first most really powerful examples I've seen of people really breaking the silos by sharing information in what I would say a real critical situation. I think you'll find it interesting to read down at the bottom here. You can see Dr. Roger Lonius, who has done a lot of work on how to say archives for the space, beginning of the space age. I think you should really take a look at his work. Second, that was second. The third point that I want to talk to you about is when you have communities in your organization, like you all do, most do, you don't want them to duplicate the organizational structure. It simply becomes, how would I say, it's like instead of having communities where people are working together across silos, you simply are duplicating silos where people are publishing information, and it becomes very confusing for users because more and more information goes into the communities or their social spaces because it's easier to put it there than it is in the traditional content management system where you have to tag it and you need a summary and that sort of thing. But if you make a rule, and I know an organization who did make a rule like that, no organizational related community is allowed. It has to be a theme or topic, something that goes across the organization. And we talk about organizations and silos across the organization. So much of it today starts from the top. And I met with an organization recently in the insurance financial services industry where they are doing this really interesting program they call job swapping. At the top levels of the organization, the top 400 people, it's not just level one at the top, it's like at least 1-2 levels down. These people, for specific periods of time, go and do someone else's job. They really truly walk in the shoes of the other person for several months. And it's building up connections and contacts across this organization among people at the top of the organization who have no particular reason to have met in the past. So just to wrap up, the last 4 points that we had about silos is the importance of educating people about what confidentiality really is, looking for ways of making work visible. The example I shared for you was all paper-based. That's the reason I shared it, rather than much easier things that can be done today with online software. But it's the idea that's important, the sharing of work that's important, even if you have nothing online. The importance of complementing and not duplicating the structure of your organization, and the fact that you do need to do some work at the top of the organization. And this particular job swapping is something I think is very interesting. It's the first time I've heard of it. Perhaps other organizations have done it. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the results coming from that experiment in a few months. So that ties up what I wanted to share with you today in terms of ways that, based on my experience and my research, you can mitigate, not remove, but you can deal with digital initiatives. Sorry, if you can deal with internal politics so that your digital initiatives can happen faster and I would say on a much more solid terrain. It's no point in having some great digital transformation program that then falls apart a year later because you have someone who disagrees with it or wasn't involved in it or whatever. I think it's really worth taking the time to set everything up properly from the beginning. So thank you very much. And I think we're going to open to questions now. Is that right, Allie?
That is right. Thank you so much, Jane. So we have several questions to get to. So that concludes the presentation portion of the program today. We've received many great questions and we'll continue to take the questions in the module for the remainder of the hour. So a reminder that you can also submit your questions on Twitter using the hashtag MIT_SMR event. So to get to some questions, not unsurprisingly, a lot of people have brought up digital transformation and undoubtedly are going through these kinds of transformations in their organizations. So I've taken a stab at kind of combining a couple of questions that came up. One was, how does an organization measure success of a digital transformation initiative? Is there a gold standard to work towards? But being that a little bit more broad, I think this follow-up might be interesting for you, Jane. Is there a framework for managing politics during the digital transformation? So what specifically from your framework and decision making might you apply to folks who are going through these kinds of shifts?
Well, I think it's possible to define a framework for how to avoid, how to lessen internal politics. And I think in a way the different points I covered here would be elements in that framework. In terms, the first question, Allie, was about measuring the success. And I think that's a question that's comes up a lot. And I think it's very important not to fall, I would say, into what I call the benchmark trap. Because if you want to benchmark yourself against another organization, you're actually comparing where you are today, where they are today. You're not looking ahead to what you're moving towards and what you could be and what transformation could bring. I think the best way to evaluate digital transformation is to be in tune with people in the organization, with customers, and listen to the stories. There are many, many anecdotes that come out of these transformation initiatives. And those anecdotes often reveal more about what's going on than some figure of 15% of the customers think that our service has improved. I think you have to listen to what people have to say And I don't think, in my experience, there's valid, I would say, quantitative ways to measure the success. You can measure participation, and 80% of our people use the social network, and you can measure all that sort of thing. But true success of a transformation exercise is initiative is how the company advances, how the business goes, how the image of the company changes, and so on.
Terrific. Thank you for that. I think that's very valuable. And another question we had gets a little bit more at the execution. And this person wrote in, most of the problems discussed have to do with people, and the solution is to talk to them and include them. Senior managers at my organization don't necessarily regard talking to people as progress. How best do you quantify the qualitative achievements of communication, and maybe how do you make that a priority for folks who haven't necessarily used that measurement in the past?
I'm sorry, I did not get the beginning of that, Ali. Could you say that again?
Sure. So this person wrote in that senior managers at their organization don't necessarily regard talking to people as progress. How best to quantify the qualitative achievements of communication?
Of communication. How best to quantify and qualify the benefits of communication.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, and this person says that the top leaders of their organization don't believe that talking to people is a valid way of measuring progress. Is that the idea behind the question?
I believe so.
Okay. So maybe this organization is looking for something that is more quantified. And I think you could come up with different, you can do surveys of your employees. You can have how would I say, workshops. You can, the variety of things that you can do. When you do surveys, you can measure something like employee involvement in this or engagement or whatever. Personally, I don't think those are the most valid ways of working. And I think that there probably would be an interest for this person and this organization to try to arrange some exchanges between leaders of senior leaders of another organization who have done some interesting things and who are, I would say, leaders that are open and participatory, and have an exchange sort of at the leadership level, which could have a lot more impact than actually within the company itself. Leaders, high-level people in one organization telling high-level people in another organization, we did this and it works well, can have more impact than people within the company itself saying exactly the same thing. It's a bit like when an external consultant comes in and says something that the project leader has been saying all along. There's more weight to the external consultant. It's a bit that same idea. But I think most people at tops of organizations are very concerned about what other companies are doing. And so I think that could be a way of getting them to open up to a different way of looking at what I would call measurement.
Great, thank you. I think that's very helpful. Another question we had come up in a couple of different ways was, on what level of the organization or in organizations do you see the most internal politics happening, Jane?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've often thought about that. I see the heavy-duty politics happening in a company that has real problems, I would say, at the top levels. But there's also a certain smoothness, desire to not bring this out of the open at the top level. Therefore, a lot of the political struggles are happening at middle management level. Middle management is in a real tricky place in transformative or digital initiatives. And I would say that the greatest political struggles in some cases will be at the top level, but very often they'll be just under the top level. And I think that when something else I didn't include in my work here, but something I think is very important, when you have a decision-making body at the top level of an organization, and you will have these political struggles and disagreements and conflicts, you need to have a CEO or a high-level person, very high-level person, who will listen to everyone and come through with a final decision. Otherwise, you can have these political struggles going on for ages and completely hold up projects. I rarely see these kind of conflicts happening at operational levels. People at operational levels want to get the work done. The customer-facing people want to satisfy customers. They've all got real goals in mind. And personally, I've never seen any real political conflicts there.
Terrific, thank you. Another question we had is around skills and sort of skill development that comes out of these kinds of changes. So what implications does this have in terms of the portfolio of skills that employees need? Has it surprised you in any way in terms of what skills might rise in importance, which ones might fall in terms of these types of digital initiatives?
I think the question about skills, pinpointing that issue is very important. Before actually answering the question, I would say that skills and understanding skills is more important today than understanding the roles that people play in organizations. And when you want to find people to work on a particular project, you need to get the right skills there, no matter what the official role of the people might be. Skills that there's been a lot of studies done on skills, and there's been some good research papers about that. They're the typical skills, like you need to learn how to communicate virtually. You need to, because more and more communication takes place online. And there's techniques and ways to run virtual meetings that are completely different from physical meetings. There's a whole concept that for me is really important. And in my own work, I have a digital workplace framework, which you can find on my website. And I have leadership at the top of it. And I define leadership as leadership coming from any level at any part of the organization that brings about change, that influences people. And so in terms of skill, a skill there is how to influence people, how to work with people on helping them see different ways of doing things. It's not a black and white question anymore. It's not the old ways of working are out the window and we all have these new ways of working. An important skill is being able to understand where the person in front of you is coming from, how you can work with that person to help them understand that there are different ways of working that are not threatening, that can actually be, I would say, positive for everyone. I think the question on skills there is a really big question that I wouldn't be able to answer properly so quickly. But I encourage whoever asked that question to maybe drop me an email, or I will think about it some more myself. I think it's a critical point. And the focus on skills today, not roles, is very important.
That is important, and that's a great starting point, Jane. And I think I agree that sounds like it's a topic that we could have a lot more discussion on at a different time. So we do have time for a couple quick final questions. One question was going back to the slide around sabotage. So what advice do you have for these types of situations and turning them into success?
Sorry, the question was about sabotage, and then you said?
Yeah, so the person asked, what advice do you have for situations like those and turning them into success?
That's the tricky thing about that particular situation is what happened. The sabotage itself happened I would say, in a black box. We don't know, the project team, or at least at the time that I was in the project, maybe they have found out since, it's been a couple of years, but we didn't know what the reason was. And so if you don't know what the reason is, there's not much you can do about it. I think that project team might have been able to find a different sponsor within the organization, because what I call the act of sabotage happened in one particular function, which I'm not going to identify. It might have been possible to find a equally high-level sponsor who believed in the project, who would then be able to convince other high-level stakeholders and management that it was important to do. But when you have something that happens at a real high level like that, it's very hard to have direct impact on it unless you get high-level support yourself. That's just the sad reality of hierarchical organizations. Now, another thing you can do is you can simply, the people in the work team, for example, could go back to their respective places and start these little initiatives here and there throughout the organization that begin to put into practice some of the things they talked about in the workshops they wanted to do. That would not, however, achieve the initial goal of the workshop, which was to have a shared digital platform across the company. They wouldn't be able to do that themselves. That has to happen at a higher level. But they could make a lot of progress to what you might call the digital way of working in their own areas, in their own way of working. They could start to bring about change in the organization in a different way. I think if you just think about it differently, find a different way that you can act.
Terrific, thank you. And one concluding question I had for you, Jane, would be, this person asked, would the same approach work for city, county, or state governments as the approach described for commercial and for-profit organizations? And I guess we could even expand that to say other settings in general outside of for-profits. Would this type of decision-making framework apply?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I can't give specific names, but I have worked with 4 different of the big UN agencies, and I'm not saying they're like city government at all, but they are certainly much closer to that than to a for-profit organization. And it comes down to what I said at the very beginning: when you get people together, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be power struggles. That's just human nature, and I think it happens pretty much everywhere. I have a number of, in my past surveys, I've had up to maybe 20% of the respondents in my surveys are from government organizations. They might be country, they might be state, they might be city. And I have found when I sort of run my little database thing to generate the different angles of analysis I'm looking for, I haven't found a lot of difference. They have similar problems. And perhaps in some cases, the internal politics could even be stronger because governments, I think, government and city and council and so on, tend to be political to some extent more than a corporation, although I do say that with hesitation. Some corporations I know are very political, but the city, the state, the nation, and so on, sometimes they are run by people who are elected. And that's not the same as being a company being run by a CEO who's been appointed. But that's a long answer. Sorry for that. I think that in general, based on my experience with clients and my experience, what I've seen in my data, there are very few differences.